Hi, this is Patsy with a Z. Welcome to Joy on Paper Live, a program for writers and those who dream of writing, and for everyone who wants to know the story behind the book. And I have a wonderful story behind this book, and we have 3 stories from New York Times best-selling author Steve Hartov. And the name of his book, I love it, it's Ménage à Noir. Hi, Steve.
Hi there, Patsy. How you doing?
Okay, great. I
Thank
love
you for
short
having
stories.
me. Thank you for having me.
Oh, anytime. I love talking to you, and I love talking about short stories. I'm a great believer in short stories. They just are fantastic. And these ones, we have some very special short stories. I am so happy with this book. I love the dedication for all the scribblers, keyboard bandits, midnight hair pullers, hard drinkers, tale weavers, and dreamers who never gave up. And of course, this program is about dreamers. And we have 3 wonderful short stories: Dead Drop, The Other End of Newbury Street, and Pocket Litter. So we've got a lot to talk about here, Steve.
Happy to talk about it, and I appreciate you having me on. Short
Okay.
stories are an art form that people don't realize is tougher than writing novels. I don't do that much of it because I've always found them to be really challenging because you have a limited amount of time or a limited amount of space, and you've got to hit all those dramatic points within that small amount of space. It's not easy. It's hard stuff to do.
You're right. And I tell people this, that it's, people will always say, I'm going to start with a, a picture book, and then I'm going to go on to the middle grade, and then I'm going to do a young adult, and then maybe I'll do some short stories, and then I'll do my novel. But actually, writing the novel is much easier. I have written, and I have written 120,000 words. I've got
Right.
120,000. I have 120. No, I have 128,000 words. That was real easy compared to now that I'm going to have to knock it down to I don't know what length. But a short story is difficult, and it is a real art.
It's a real art form. It's a lost art form. You don't see them too much anymore. Very rare. It used to be all the literary publications, you'd have a short story every week, and sometimes they were by very famous authors and so forth. And you just don't see that anymore. Print magazine publications have died anyway. And then the venues for having short stories might be digital or online, but it's not quite the same
No,
as it used to be.
it's not the same. It has to be on paper. Short stories really do have to be on paper. In the old days, even Playboy would print short stories.
Yes, that's
They
right.
were they were all over the place. And you're right, we don't see enough of course, we don't see enough of printed material anymore. But I'm glad that you got this book done, and it's a perfect gift book. It's not too long, and the nice thing, it's like an anthology. There's always one story that will absolutely capture you. You'll read all 3 of them, but one of them will click with you. So that's why it's always great to give an anthology or a collection of short stories to people as a gift.
Yeah, I think so too. I have the same experience. I can sometimes there'll be a collection of short stories, some of the greats, the Hemingway collection or O. Henry's or whatever, but you always have one story that just jumps out at you, and you never know what that's going to be for your own readers. But the book, which is now just came out in a nice little hardcover as well, and it's published by 4 p.m. Press. List Alone is the publisher, and so
Nice.
we decided to limit it and not overburden the readers with 12 different stories. 3 was enough.
Yeah, it's great. It's just the right price, so you can price. It is a prize, but it's the right price that you can buy a bunch of them and give them to people, and there can be stocking stuffers or whatever. First night of Hanukkah, something like that. Just just to have something interesting to read and something to talk about. You want to let just give a little hint of each of the stories and what they're about and what people can discover from them, because in fact they are all based on things that you've done in your life, things that you've been involved in, places you've gone.
Yes, pretty much all of my fiction is that way. I'm not one of those guys or one of those writers who has a vast imagination and can make up worlds and create worlds and so forth. I'm of the old school where I did it first by wandering around the world and meeting people and having my own adventures and then taking those things and using them later in my fictional works, which I've been doing now for many decades. So I packed the front of my life with all sorts of crazy adventures, and then I'm still able to pull from those things and use them in various places. The first story in this Dead Drop came out of a period in my life when I was doing a lot of scuba diving. And I was also traveling around the world. I'd spent a lot of time overseas and also in Manhattan and down in the Caribbean. And so I knew characters and people from that I could just pull and weave together for that mystery story, which I've played with turning it into a novel or a series of novels, but I haven't done that yet. But I enjoyed writing that, and I started that story many years ago, and I've revised it a number of times since as I honed my craft. And then the middle story, The Other End of Newbury Street, was based on a time when I lived in Boston and I got to know the backwaters of Boston very well and some of the seedier characters. I'm always driven to go seek out the seedier parts of the town because the people are the most interesting to me there. That's why it's called The Other End of Newbury Street, because Newbury Street in Boston has a reputation of being kind of highfalutin and expensive shops and so forth. But when I lived in Boston, the other end was the rougher part. That's a flat out private eye character study. And then the last one, Pocket Litter, was based on my experiences in the Israeli army and also in special operations and intelligence. And those characters in that short story come out of the three novels, espionage novels that I wrote starting in the early 90s and going into the 2000s. The Heat of Ramadan, The Nylon Hand of God, The Devil's Shepherd. And the lead characters in those books are a younger Army intelligence captain, later major, named Eitan Eckstein, and his sort of mentor, boss, partner, an older man named Benny Baum. And I've written thousands of words about those characters and over 1,000 pages of published novels about them. So this was an homage to Tan and Benny, and I'll probably write some more of those short stories because I really enjoy those two fellows, and a lot of folks are drawn to them for their relationship and their characters and the adventures they get themselves into.
Well,
So
I love
those are the three stories I tackled.
well, I really love Pocket Litter. I love all of them, but that one particularly because you take us to Vienna, and I
Yes.
love that. And I remember to be in Vienna on particularly in the wintertime when you find a cafe, a restaurant run by a family, and you can sit in there and eat goulash and have fresh bread, and they let you sit there. When I was there, and I didn't have a lot of money the first time I went there, and so I would go to a restaurant like that and sit and one small bowl of goulash and the fresh bread, and then coffee and strudel, and it could last me for hours. I could be reading the Herald Tribune, which you mentioned in that,
Right.
and that's something I can. I the minute I read that story, I want goulash. I want to go to Vienna because there's no place like it, and they're very kind. Well, in those days, they didn't rush you, and you had all the newspapers were hanging from poles, and you could sit
That's
there and
right.
read.
They have
It's
the newspaper racks in their cafes. They're still like that. I've spent an awful lot of time in Vienna. My mother was born in Vienna, so I started going there when I was very young, and I can't count the number of times or how long I've been in Vienna, but it's a very special city. Even now, with all of its troubles, it's still one of the classic cities of
Yeah,
Europe.
if you can find one of those restaurants, and they're owned by a family, and they knew that I didn't have money, and sometimes they give me an extra piece of bread and refill of a cafe. It was just a wonderful time that I spent there. Of course,
Mhm.
later on, when I was richer, I would be at the Hilton. Do you remember the spiral stairs down to the lobby?
At the Yes, I do. I
Yeah,
do. And is the Hilton over by the Danube, or is it the Sheridan that's over by the Danube? I can't
the
remember
Sheraton's
which
by
of
the
them is
Danube,
over
I
by
think.
the Sheridan's by the Danube.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but the Hilton is the one with the stairs. I love those stairs.
Yeah.
I was young in those days, wearing high heels, and when you'd walk down those stairs, all the guys would look at you. It was so wonderful. I, I spent so much time in Vienna. I loved it. I loved it. It's fun to have a book like this. And I like very much your introduction. And this is the time of the year. It's just November, and a lot of my listeners and viewers took part in NaNoWriMo, the National Novel Writing Month. And these are all people
Mm-hmm.
who have uh, over the years, I've opened the program saying this is a program for people who are dreaming of writing. And so I loved your opening. Explain how you look at writing, and that it's important that people understand that writers are made and not born. So explain.
When I was sitting down to write that introduction, generally, when I sit down and write a novel, and I've written quite a few of them, you don't open a novel by explaining your take on literature or life. You just open with the story. And it's the same thing with a nonfiction book. It's not about you, it's about the subject matter, whether it be when I wrote In the Company of Heroes, it was about Mike Durant and Mogadishu, or The Night Stalkers, whatever, Afghanistan on the bounce. It's not about my philosophy of writing. But I finally, for the first time in decades, felt like I had this opportunity to talk about the art. I decided to open with Writers Are Made, Not Born, which is the way I feel about it. I think, Patsy, you'd agree that there are some people who have an inherent ability to tell a story. But to write a story, you've got to hone your craft to write it well. You have to work very hard to get to the point where people want to read you, but they don't feel like they're working at it. So I opened this collection with a couple of pages about how I feel about the craft of writing and how I got there, and who I admire in terms of other writers, and how I'm unapologetic about the language that I use, and I don't fall into the modern trap of political correctness and how you have to be so careful about what you say about everybody. I just write what I see and write what I hear, and that's it. The rest is up to the reader, or the buyer beware.
That's true. You have to be true to yourself, and that authenticity comes through in your writing. Now, you didn't start off when you were young. You were you planning to be a writer, and then you just decided instead to start living an exciting life.
Basically, yes. I wasn't sure what I was going to do, but I was highly enamored of the great writers of the time. And I read a lot of historical novels and historical fiction and so forth. And in particular, I was saturated with the post World War II subject matter. The folks I admired were usually veterans, and a lot of the books were about World War II or about that era. And I just came to understand that all of these folks were able to write so well about their adventures and experiences because they had actually done them. They weren't things that you could just read some research and then create those worlds and have anyone believe it. Um, I was watching a film and the book I'm sure you know very well the other day, Catch 22, and Joseph Heller had to go through hell for him to be able to finally write a really snarky, satirical, funny book, and also tragic, but funny book about his experiences as a bombardier in World War II. I understood that for me to be able to write really well about interesting things, I would have to just get out in the world and start doing some stuff. And I did that for a long time before I felt like I could sit down and write. I would take notes and so forth, and maybe I'd write a piece of a short story in a cafe somewhere in Europe or the Middle East or Israel, whatever. But serious writing I didn't do until I was already in my 30s.
So tell us about some of the authors that really impressed you as a young man, and which ones made such an impression that they've stayed with you all these years.
The first actually adult author that I got to read, I was one of those kids who was reading what all kids were reading at the time, the Hardy Boys and that sort of thing. And then I was only about 9 when my mother handed me a copy of The Guns of Navarone by Alistair MacLean. And that was it. I was off and running. She felt that I was old enough to understand the language because I was a pretty good reader. So then for a while it was Alistair MacLean, and then went on to reading all the World War II greats: Leon Uris, James A. Michener, Hemingway, Joseph Heller, Norman Mailer, all the great male veteran authors of that period became the people who I tried to emulate as a writer. Herman Wouk, I loved Herman Wouk, and he would write these endless tomes about World War II and then about the Middle East. I read all of his stuff. And then I would go back and read stories, John Dos Passos and the O. Henry stories, F. Scott Fitzgerald. I read them all, and voraciously. And then you can learn a lot about writing by reading.
Oh, yes.
I think our young folks nowadays don't read.
Oh, no. I can't imagine them reading a Michener. How big was Hawaii? How many pages was it?
Oh, 800 or so. But what's interesting is that, and I don't mean to disparage young people at all. This is not their responsibility, that society has become so digital that they're not encouraged to actually hold a physical book. But there are trends in the younger society for reading fantasy and science fiction that are tomes,
Yeah.
which began back in my era with Dune and books like that. But for the most part, I don't see the younger generations sitting by a pool with a novel. They're much more likely to be sitting by a pool with a headset on or earbuds in, or maybe reading a magazine article on the phone, sometimes Kindle. But you can see the trends. You just get on an airplane and you see how many people are holding a physical book, how many people are reading Kindle on a book, and for the most part, people are just watching a movie, which is fine. But as writers, we realize that our world is definitely shrinking. It is not what it was 30 years ago at all.
Or a Clancy. Clancy books were very thick.
Oh, they were huge. They were huge, physically huge, and they were huge bestsellers. Stephen King, I don't know that Stephen King, if he were beginning his career now, would have a career. He might, but the styles have changed to the point where some of these authors who are already ensconced in the literary atmosphere might hold on, but a lot of them would not be able to begin careers now, certainly not writing in the styles that they wrote in 30 years ago. I'm sure you've noticed this as well. If you pick up a modern day thriller, chapters used to be much more thick and extensive and complex. If you pick up a modern day thriller, you'll notice that whereas the same book written 30 years ago might only have 22 chapters, the same modern day thriller that's basically telling the same story will have 45 or 55 chapters, because the publishers understand that their audience has been trained to have a short attention
Attention
span.
span. Yep.
So they need to be able to read a chapter in 5 minutes before they go to bed, not read part of a chapter or spend half an hour reading a chapter. Which is also why we see this phenomenon now of, if you open your phone and your phone is telling you to read an article in The Atlantic, it will say right at the bottom of the article, 4-minute read, because it's telling you, we understand that you don't have a lot of time or patience for this, so we're going to tell you how short it is. And that's how we're training our readers nowadays, is to have shorter retention spans, read less, read slimmer books,
About
and
the
so forth.
attention span that it takes to do on television, whatever it is they devote to ads, 3 to 5 minutes, and that's the attention span, which is sad. But there was a point. Now the Harry Potter books are old. I mean, the, when you look
Yes,
at it when they first came out, but they were so big, and the kids were reading them, and so that it was
Tolkien,
there.
same thing.
Yeah, but gradually it has gotten worse, and of course with this constantly looking at your phone for information, which you probably don't need anyway, and it's I don't know if it's deliberately done. Now you're hearing stories that when kids go to Harvard, they need remedial reading before they can actually take classes. Now, how can you get
Yes.
into Harvard and you need remedial reading classes? all of the founding fathers who went to Harvard. They already knew Latin, Greek, and probably Hebrew, and they were entering Harvard at the age of 16.
I'm sure it's very simple. We've lowered our standards across the board. We've lowered our standards for middle school, high school, and therefore, once you've done that, you can't have the expectation that the applicants to these, even to these Ivy League schools, are going to be able to compete with the same level of student that would have appeared 30 years ago to apply for that school. Harvard used to be, you had to be the absolute cream of the crop to even have them consider you. And now they have lowered their standards for many different reasons, but I don't understand that either.
I want to show you something. I just happen to have this because I've been going through some of my books, and I have this book. Now, this is a very old book, and it is called Prose and Poetry, fourth year. This is a fourth,
Oh,
I'm talking fourth grade. Fourth grade. But they were reading at such a level. And these kids in fourth grade, they were reading a serious literature, and the vocabulary in this book. I
mm-hmm.
don't think high school graduates have this vocabulary.
No, not anymore. Not anymore. Evidence, Patsy, of the deterioration of the language across the board. I'm frequently watching, when I'm watching news anchors of various networks, I'll watch them mispronounce words, or I'll watch the Chiron generator and see when it isn't done by AI, when there's actual physical person doing Chiron, misspellings and misuse of words, mispronunciations, and it's indicative of the whole educational system, which is deteriorating. But I also think that, just like in with every generation, there is always a corner of the society that's going to maintain these standards, the high standards. For example, my son is 35, my older son, and my younger son is going to be 30. They read at an extremely high level. They devour books. They will read philosophy and psychology and fiction and nonfiction, and their collections are very impressive. And it's not just because their father's a writer. I think that there is a whole segment of our society that will always be that way, thankfully. But it ebbs and flows, and for those of us who actually make a living at writing, you can see that the trends at the moment are not so great in terms of publishing and writing, and that it's becoming more and more niche.
Yeah, and that's sad because there's no reason they can't read. It's basically phonics, learning phonics. If you learn phonics, then you can read, but they don't teach phonics. And they teach this whole word stuff.
I think we have a major problem in that we have a Department of Education that makes no demands on our students in terms of their capabilities. So when you're afraid to tell a student that he or she are not living up to the standards that are required to move on to a higher education, when you're afraid to say that, then they're just not going to, you've already lost the battle. You have to have discipline. You have to insist that kids pass tests and that there be a standardization test, and that they're not going to get degrees in high school unless they can pass those tests. And once you surrender and don't insist on it, you're done. The American, unfortunately, we used to be on the list of academic excellence and achievement. We were 1, 2, or 3 at the top of the food chain, and now we're down 30, 40 in the world. And certainly not great for writers and authors.
Let's go back to your book. I like also your introduction. Explain why you wrote that, and who are the hard drinkers that you were referring to.
Scribblers, keyboard bandits, midnight hair pullers. That's all of us who are up at 2 o'clock in the morning trying to figure out how to fix this paragraph, or open a story, or change the plot so that it makes sense. And some of us are hard drinkers, some of us are not. Hemingway used to say, "Write drunk, edit sober." So I think a lot of people are not necessarily writing drunk. They do imbibe on occasion, and tail weaver's obvious. But they're all dreamers who never gave up, and those are the people who wind up in print. Lots of people think about writing, and they dream about writing, and they want to be famous novelists or just published novelists. It's just a pipe dream that they never really go after, but The dreamers who never gave up are the people who just keep going and going, and eventually they wind up publishing something one way or the other.
So who came up with the title for the book, Ménage à Noir? I like it.
My publisher, Liz Malone, we had these three short stories. I said, I don't know what to call them. We can call them by the title of one of the stories. We can call them Dead Drop, a collection, or Pocket Litter, a collection. And she said, how about Ménage à Noir? And I said, perfect, let's go.
It
It's a
is
great
perfect.
title. Yeah.
Absolutely.
It was all her genius.
That's great. I love it. I thought it was really great. It's certainly a title. I think also I'm thinking from the point of view of a gift, that if you give this as a gift, there's something just intriguing about the title. It makes you want to open the book and read it.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that. And the little hardcover that just came out is a really nice package. So is the paperback. And I guess you can't really give a Kindle as a gift. You can't stuff that in a stocking, but the other two
No,
are
and it's better to
nice
have
little compact packages.
it's better to have the real book. I will read Kindles and I will read even Audible books, but there's nothing like having a real book in your hand. It's a combination of things. A real book is tactile, and it has a feel, and it has a smell, and it has, so you have all the senses are involved in it, where you don't have that with Kindle or Audible. In fact, although I will listen to Audible books, I don't know if this is how it works with you. For me, it's in one ear, out the other. I don't retain uh, the story. Now, for example, I can now I can think about your stories, and I can remember the words on the page. I can remember the, when you write about the Herald Tribune, when you write about, I see it. Physically, I see the words flash in my head. And I love that. I love that about a real book.
I'm the same way, but that could be also, Patsy, because that's the way we were brought up and trained, was the written word on page, in print, and physically writing, which sort of engraves it into your mind, as opposed to listening to something, which I'm the same way. I don't listen to a lot of audiobooks because I like to actually read. And I also, it's, there's something tactile about it. If I want to flip back a page or two to look at something again, it's different than scrolling. And certainly if you're listening to an audiobook and you miss something or you didn't quite understand something, you're not likely to, as
Go
you're
back. No,
driving in
no,
your
you're not.
car, rewind it and hear it again. You let it go, which is why it doesn't sink into your brain in the same way.
Yeah, it's not the same retention. Do you ever go back and you say, wow, did I write that? It's so good.
I would never admit that. Yeah, sometimes you go back and you say, boy, that there was a lot of hard work that went into that paragraph. I wonder if I could pull that off again. But you have to push through and just work just as hard on the next book. There is no letting up off the gas, especially as you go further in your career. Some things become easier. Structure and drama and so forth may become easier, but the writing becomes no easier. You have to work just as hard at it in your 60s as you did in your 30s, or the quality becomes obviously of a lesser degree. And that in writers, if you particularly very popular writers who are writing the same characters over and over again, after a while, you'll see the fatigue in the writing. I'm sure you've seen that.
Oh, yes, I've seen that many times, too many times.
We won't name names, right?
No, we know won't name names. But it's just wonderful. I love this book. I think it's really fantastic. Anyway, Steve, it was so great to talk to you about the new book, Ménage à Noir. It's a great gift book, a great book just to have one cold evening here now that we are in the wintertime. Again, thank you for joining me today. These are little slices of life, and it proves to people who are wondering, should they go to university and learn how to write, or should they live a life? I think it's so much better to live an exciting and interesting life like you have, and then you have something to write about. You write about a place, and I've probably been there. It doesn't matter where.
Yeah, you can't be fooled.
I recognize when it's somebody's doing a Wikipedia dump on me.
Exactly, exactly.
So that's why I love your writing, because when I say authentic, it's authentic. You've been there, you've done these things, and you know about it.
Thank you so much. I, I appreciate that too. And it's really good when somebody recognizes that and they know why you're doing what you're doing, or they can sense it's, there aren't that many readers out there who can read somebody's work and go, okay, that's real or that's not. So it's great when you get the recognition for that. So I appreciate it.
I won't ever do much traveling anymore because just the world's changed. It's not fun like it was in the old days. It was more fun in
Mm.
the old days to travel when you had to get lots of shots. Do you remember getting all these shots and you had your little book that showed that you had your
Yep.
shots and you went through? And so, again, you bring us back to some of these wonderful times. I hope everybody will get Ménage and Noir. So, everybody can find out more about your writing and they can find out more about all of the books. And as I said, you're a New York Times bestselling author, and really all of your books are fantastic. And they can see you at stevenhartov.com, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Again, thank you so much for joining me today on Joy on Paper Live. You.
See you soon.
Okay. Bye bye now. Bye.
Bye.
Turn the house